Hello again, it's me, Logan, from kidshumanity.com, and we're continuing to reading Creation versus Evolution. You guys ready? Let's dive in. Scientific Evidence, Chapter 2. Scientific evidence for creation abounds, from the intricacies of the living cell to the majesty of the solar system. The universe confirms biblical creation. As one example, we could discuss the information content in the DNA of living organisms. As far as we know, creative information can only originate in the mind. Experience confirms this. We read books with information in them, and although a book might be a copy of a copy of a copy, we presume that it has an original author. Likewise, the information in DNA, although it's been copied many times, must have an original author that stems from an intelligent mind. Just as the Bible teaches, it cannot be the result of chance, mutations, and natural selection. We could discuss the fossil record, which contains the mineralized remains of organisms that once lived on Earth. This is exactly what creationists would expect to find, since the Bible records a global flood which destroyed virtually all life on Earth, burying billions of organisms in sediments which would have now turned to rock. These fossils come in distinct groups of kinds, which are found in a somewhat organized order, consistent with the progressive order in which these organisms were buried in the flood. Waters rose to higher elevations with much different ecologies. Although there is much variation within each type of taxonomic family, if there's little to any evidence of change between those basic kinds, which is exactly what creationists would expect, but contrary to the natural expectations of evolutionists. We would go on, yet evolutionists are not convinced by such lines of evidence. Moreover, many evolutionists would say that the fossil record actually supports evolution rather than refuting it. Some say the science of genetics actually supports an evolutionary outlook, not creation. They have suggested explanations for all the lines of evidence that apparently support creation, and have argued that such evidence actually supports evolution instead. Evidence and worldviews. It seems almost paradoxical at first that both creationists and evolutionists would appeal to the very same evidence in support of their opposing positions. We might be inclined to think that creationists would use one line of evidence and evolutionists would just use another, but this just isn't the case. Both sides appeal to the fossil records in genetics. Both appeal to the rock layers and canyons. Both appeal to the methods and procedures of science. In some cases, the two camps may appeal to the exact same evidence with support of their competing positions. What is going on here? Obviously, the debate cannot be about different lines of evidence, because we all observe the same evidence. Creationists and evolutionists have the same fossils, the same rock layers, and the same access to genetic code. In other words, we have the same world in the difference. We have the same world. The difference is how the two sides interpret the evidence. Human reason. That's not how I see it. See how this evidence says the Bible is true? The evolutionist takes similarities in DNA of different kinds of organisms to be indicative to common ancestry, whereas the creationist takes those same similarities to the evidence of their common creator and similar purpose. Creationists and evolutionists do not be indicative of common ancestry, whereas the creationist takes those same similarities to be evidence of their common creator and similar purpose. Creationists and evolutionists do not believe and disagree on the evidence itself, just both believe that the organisms have similarities in DNA. Rather, they disagree on how the evidence should be interpreted. They have different views on the world. The origin debates, therefore, is really a debate over competing worldviews, competing ways of understanding the world. The The biblical creationist uses the history recorded in the Bible to help understand the evidence. Usually, the evolutionist rejects biblical history and uses another standard instead. Often, the evolutionist standard is naturalism, the belief that nature can stand alone, can account for the origin of the universe and life. Putting it another way, the creationists and the evolutionists use a different ultimate standard, which they judge various claims. Consequently, they come to different conclusions about the same evidence. Therefore, scientific and historical evidence by itself cannot logically settle the origins of this debate. Each party will interpret the evidence in his light or her worldview. The creationists will honestly believe that the evidence confirms creation, whereas the evolutionists will honestly believe that the same evidence is consistent with evolution. Consider this example. C14 is an unstable isotope of carbon created in the upper atmosphere, which naturally spontaneously decays or changes into nitrogen with time. This happens on a time scale for thousands of years. Now, C14 has been found deep down in the rock layers that evolution is believed is to be millions of years old. But if that were in fact even 1 million years old, they should not even contain one atom of C14 because it would have all decayed into nitrogen. This certainly seems to support the biblical creationists' claim that the Earth was made thousands, not billions, of years ago, and that many of the upper rock layers were depositing during the global flood described in Genesis 6:8. But an evolutionist would not necessarily be persuaded by such evidence. He would invent a rescuing device to explain that such evidence in the light of his worldview. He says, perhaps there is an unknown process deep in those rock layers which produces new C14 as quickly as new C14 decays. Although such process has not ever been discovered, the evolutionist is free to postulate that it could be discovered in the future. And, of course, creationists are also free to invoke a rescuing device to account for any alleged evidence for the evolution or vast ages. Since each side interprets the evidence in their light of his or her worldview, how can we logically prove one worldview over the other? How to resolve a worldview issue? How can the origin debates be rationally resolved? Which each side is interpreting the scientific and historical evidence in light of their respective worldview. It may seem that there is no way to settle this debate, but in fact there is. We can logically demonstrate that the biblical worldview must be true by showing the absurdity of the contrary view. What we are going to do is an internal critique of the evolutionary worldview. This is to show that their worldview cannot be true because it self-destructs on its own terms. If I were to argue that my opponent's position is wrong on the basis of a particular line of evidence that I interpret according to my worldview, that would be unfair and irrational. Such an argument is unsound because it merely assumes that my way of interpreting evidence is the right way. But that is the very claim at issue. It begs the question. It would be like saying my opponent's worldview is wrong because it goes against my worldview, which is right. Such an argument proves nothing. Rather than evaluating an opponent's worldview by our own, we must evaluate the opponent's worldview on its own terms, looking for internal defects. Specifically, there are 3 things we can look for in a worldview: arbitrariness, inconsistency, and preconditions of knowledge. If a worldview is defective in any of those areas, then it is not rational to hold. We will see that evolution fails all these 3 tests, but creation passes spectacularly. We're going to end here today, and those 3 points will be continued in part 3. See you guys later. Bye.
He is the way, the truth, and the life. Seek him as he is seeking you.